Good evening and welcome to the Standing Resolution, the show where we put our best arguments on paper. Or, as tonight might suggest, maybe we shouldn't. I'm your moderator, Justice Vale, and here's what's at stake. In a world where nearly every word we produce is typed, tapped, or dictated, schools are being asked a very practical question. Is teaching children to write by hand still worth the time, the curriculum space, and the chalk dust? The answer, depending on who you ask, is either obviously yes or obviously no. And tonight, we're going to find out which. Our resolution this evening read exactly as submitted. Handwriting should still be taught in schools. Two debaters. One will argue in favor that handwriting belongs in modern education and deserves its place in the classroom. The other will argue against, that it's an artifact of a previous century and schools have better things to do. I'll note, as we always do on this program, that each debater was assigned their position. Whether it matches their personal beliefs is, frankly, none of our business. Their job is to make the case. Your job is to listen carefully. We'll hear opening statements first, each side.
Let me start with something unglamorous, because that's usually where the truth lives. Every year, millions of children sit down to take standardized tests, fill out government forms, sign legal documents, and write in circumstances where no keyboard is available, the battery is dead, or the screen is simply not permitted. Handwriting is not a nostalgic flourish. It is a functional skill with a flaw that, once missed in childhood, is genuinely difficult to recover. But let's go deeper than the practical, because the practical alone isn't the whole case. There is something that happens in the brain when a child forms letters by hand that does not happen when they tap a key. The motion is slow, deliberate, and deeply connected to the act of thinking. Researchers who study learning have observed consistently that students who take notes by hand tend to process and retain information more thoroughly than those who type. And the reason isn't mysterious. When you write by hand, you cannot transcribe everything, so you are forced to understand, to summarize, to choose. That constraint is not a bug. It is the entire feature. Now I want to be careful here because I know what the odds.
Mordecai made a careful case, and I want to meet it carefully. But I think he's defending the wrong thing with the right instincts. Here's the first principle I want to plant in the ground tonight. School time is finite, and every hour we spend on one thing is an hour we don't spend on another. That's not a rhetorical trick, it's arithmetic. So the question isn't, is handwriting harmless? The question is whether handwriting instruction is the best use of that irreplaceable time. And I think when you press on that question honestly, the answer is no. Let's be precise about what we're actually debating. Nobody is proposing we ban pens. Nobody is saying children shouldn't scribble, doodle, or jot a grocery list. The question is whether formal, dedicated classroom instruction in handwriting deserves a protected slot in the curriculum. And on that specific question, the case falls apart. Mordecai's strongest point is the cognitive one, the idea that writing by hand forces synthesis and deeper processing. I find that genuinely interesting, but notice what it actually argues for. It argues for slowing down, for deliberate thinking, for not transcribing mindlessly. You can get all of T.
Both sides have drawn their lines, and I'll give them this, neither one blinked. Mordecai says the hand and the mind are partners in a way no keyboard can replicate. Holly says that's a lovely thought, but lovely thoughts don't write the curriculum. When we come back, they get to say what they really think of each other's arguments. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back, I'm Justice Vale, and you're watching the Standing Resolution, where tonight we're debating whether handwriting should still be taught in schools. Both sides have made their opening case, and now it's time to test those arguments. Rebuttals are up next.
Holly's made two moves I want to look at closely, because one of them is genuinely clever and one of them quietly proves my case. The clever one is the reframe of cognitive benefit. Holly says you can get the same deep processing through annotation and deliberate typing, that it's effortful encoding that matters, not the physical act. That's an interesting argument, but it slides past something important. The effort in handwriting is not incidental to the skill, it is the mechanism. The slowness, the motor memory, the physical formation of each letter, these aren't obstacles we're asking children to endure on the way to some abstract cognitive payoff. They are how the payoff arrives. You cannot straightforwardly replicate that by teaching someone to type more thoughtfully. The medium shapes the experience in ways that aren't freely interchangeable. Now the fire-starting analogy. I want to be fair to it because analogies deserve fair treatment, but there's a disqualifying difference. Starting a fire is a discrete survival skill most people will never need. Writing by hand is a basic mode of literate communication that millions of people use routinely in hospitals, courtrooms, cl.
Mordecai just said the slowness and the motor memory and the physical formation of letters are how the cognitive payoff arrives. That's a strong claim, and it might even be true for some learners. But notice what it requires him to prove. It requires him to show that this specific physical mechanism is irreplaceable, that no other form of effortful, deliberate practice produces equivalent results. He hasn't shown that. He's asserted it. And on the fire analogy, he says handwriting is different because millions of people use it routinely. But that number is shrinking with every generation, and the direction of travel matters. We don't design curricula around the world of 20 years ago. We design them around the world children are actually entering. If the honest trend is toward less handwriting in daily life, then the urgency of formal instruction diminishes with it. Here's what I think is really happening in Mordecai's argument. He's identified something genuinely valuable: slow thinking, deliberate processing, the discipline of choosing your words carefully, and he's attached it to handwriting because that's where he first encountered it. But the valuable thing and the vehicle.
Mordecai, you've argued that the physical act of forming letters is the actual mechanism behind deeper cognitive processing, not just a helpful context for it. So here's the specific problem with that. The strongest handwriting research tends to study note-taking in lectures, a context that's already disappearing from early childhood education. What's your evidence that the cognitive benefit transfers to the age and setting where handwriting is actually being taught?
That's a fair challenge, and I won't dodge it. You're right that much of the research on note-taking and retention involves older students, but I'd ask you to look at what happens earlier because the developmental case is actually stronger there, not weaker. When young children learn to form letters by hand, they are simultaneously learning to recognize those letters, to understand their structure, to connect sound to symbol. Reading researchers have found that handwriting practice in early childhood accelerates literacy acquisition in ways that typing simply does not replicate at that stage. The hand teaches the eye. So the cognitive argument isn't just about lecture notes. It runs all the way down to the foundation of how children become literate in the first place. That's not a marginal benefit. That's the ground floor, and the ground floor is exactly where you cannot afford to experiment with removal.
Hollies, you've argued that effortful encoding is what matters, and that we can teach deliberate thinking without handwriting mechanics. But here's the pressure point. You haven't named what actually replaces it, not in the abstract specifically. What is the concrete classroom practice you're proposing that delivers the same deliberate, slow engagement with language for a 6-year-old who is still learning to read?
That's the right question to ask, and I want to answer it honestly rather than dodge it. For a 6-year-old learning to read, I'm not proposing we hand them a laptop and wish them luck. I'm proposing we let natural, incidental writing do the work it already does. Children draw, trace, copy, doodle. That motor engagement with letters can happen through playful, embedded practice without becoming a formal instructional subject with dedicated curriculum hours and standardized assessment. Beyond that, there are tools now, tablets with stylus input, tracing apps, tactile letter boards that preserve the physical engagement with letter forms without locking us into the full architecture of traditional penmanship instruction. My argument has never been that young children shouldn't touch a pencil. It's that formal, protected, assessed handwriting instruction is the thing that needs to justify its place. Incidental engagement with letters is not the same as a mandated subject. That distinction is where my case actually lives.
That distinction Hollies just drew between incidental contact with a pencil and formal protected instruction might be the hinge this whole debate turns on. And in a moment, we're going to find out how sturdy that hinge really is, because next up is the Steelman round, where each debater has to make the other side's best argument. You will not want to miss this. Welcome back to the Standing Resolution. I'm Justice Vale, and we are deep in the debate over whether handwriting still belongs in our schools. Now comes the part of the evening I find most revealing, the Steelman round, where each debater has to argue the other side as compellingly as they possibly can.
Here is the strongest version of Holly's case, and I want to give it its full weight. Schools are not just buildings. They are a bet on the future, and the future is not evenly distributed. A child in an underfunded district whose teacher has 40 minutes to cover literacy, numeracy, and everything else is not well served by a curriculum that still reserves time for the physical mechanics of cursive loops because those mechanics once mattered. Every hour is a choice, and the choice has a cost. If formal handwriting instruction crowds out time for reading comprehension or mathematical reasoning, or the kind of critical thinking that actually travels across every domain a child will inhabit, then we have sentimentalized a delivery mechanism at the expense of the thing being delivered. The world those children are entering will ask them to read, to reason, and to communicate. It will ask them to do most of that on screens. Meeting them where they are going is not a concession to laziness. It is the basic job of education. That is a real argument, I respect it. But here is where it breaks down for me. The premise assumes we know the cost of removing handwriting instruction, and
Here is the most honest case for keeping handwriting in schools, and I want to give it the respect it deserves. There is a window in early childhood when the brain is building the architecture of literacy from scratch. During that window, the physical act of forming a letter, tracing its curves, feeling the resistance of pencil on paper, appears to reinforce the neural pathways that allow a child to recognize that same letter when reading. The hand teaches the eye. That is not sentiment. That is a plausible account of how young minds actually construct the skill of reading. And if it's correct, then removing the physical engagement with letter forms during that critical period isn't a neutral trade-off. It's pulling a load-bearing wall out of the foundation and hoping the ceiling holds. That is the strongest version of Mordecai's case, and I want to say clearly, I take it seriously. But here is why it doesn't change my position. What that argument actually defends is early tactile engagement with letters, tracing, drawing, physical contact with the shapes of written language. It does not defend formal, assessed, protected handwriting instruction as a distinct curriculum subject.
Both sides have now argued the other's case, and done it well enough that I'm not entirely sure who's winning anymore. That's exactly where we want to be heading into closing arguments, where each debater gets one last shot to make it stick. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Standing Resolution. I'm Justice Vale, and we have arrived at the moment that counts. Both sides have made their case, tested each other's, and now it comes down to this: closing arguments on whether handwriting should still be taught in schools. Last words make them matter.
here is what this debate has actually been about. Holly's has drawn a distinction repeatedly and carefully between incidental contact with letters and formal instruction, and I want to grant that it's a real distinction, but I want to ask what happens when you rely on the incidental. You get uneven results. Some children get the tracing, the tactile engagement, the physical encounter with letter forms. Others don't because their classroom is stretched, their home is stretched, and nobody is making sure the gap gets filled. Formal instruction is how we guarantee the floor. Incidental practice is how we hope for the best. Holly's also said the valuable thing Mordecai is defending is thoughtfulness, not penmanship, and that thoughtfulness deserves better than to be tied to a fading delivery mechanism. I turn that around. Thoughtfulness is precisely what's at stake when we ask whether we've truly counted the cost of this removal. We have not been thoughtful about this. We've been in a hurry. The children in our schools right now are not a pilot program. They don't get a second pass if we discover 10 years from now that something foundational was quietly missing. Teach handwrit.
Mordecai ended with a warning about impatience. I want to end with a question about honesty. Throughout this debate, the case for formal handwriting instruction has kept quietly shifting. First, it was practical necessity. Then it was cognitive depth. Then it was the developmental window. Each time I pressed on one pillar, the argument moved to another. That's not a sign of a strong case. That's a sign of a conclusion in search of a justification. The one argument that genuinely gave me pause was the developmental one, the hand teaching the eye, the physical engagement with letter forms during the window when literacy is being built. I said so openly. But that argument defends touching letters. It does not defend penmanship as a protected subject with its own curriculum hours and its own assessed standards. Mordecai never closed that gap. He just kept asking me to treat them as the same thing. The floor Mordecai wants to guarantee can be built into reading instruction, into early literacy practice, into the natural encounter with written language that already happens in good classrooms. You don't need a separate subject to lay a foundation. You need a clear understanding of why.
And that's where we leave it. Mordecai Quill argued that the hand and the mind are partners in a way we discard at our peril, that formal instruction is how we guarantee a floor, not just hope for one. Hollis Vega argued that the floor can be laid a different way, and that protecting a separate subject in an already crowded curriculum requires more than a shifting set of justifications. Both of them meant it. Both of them earned the room. Who made the stronger case tonight is not my call to make, and honestly, I think that's the right outcome. This is one of those questions that deserves to live in the hands of the people closest to it, parents, teachers, and the students who will spend their lives with whatever we decide. So think it over, argue about it at dinner. That's what this show is for. If you'd like to help choose what we debate next, head to Paxelle.tv. Your vote picks the next resolution, and we take those results seriously. One thing before you go, the standing resolution features AI personas built for debate and entertainment. The positions you heard tonight were assigned, not chosen. Mordecai and Hollis argued what they were given, and they gave it everything.